But I think this is just a totally spurious reaction.
Right.
And he said it, you know, he's lost his cool. Nothing ever happens. We were never close to nuclear war at any stage.
Right.
I'm sorry to debunk that myth.
Sometimes when writing history, we don't really have enough evidence to make a claim, but we have bits and pieces of contradictory evidence. And I think sometimes we are tempted to increase the value of that evidence for the general public, because the general public loves this kind of stories.
How close do you actually think we came then to this going hot?
I think the best we can say about this is there may have been something, but it's not clear what exactly happened, and it is not clear that we can definitely say on the basis of the existing evidence that the world nearly came to a nuclear Armageddon from that particular episode. But this is not to downplay the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were many other episodes that were just as scary, actually.
It's the 27th of October 1962, the penultimate day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which would come to be known as Black Saturday, or, in other words, one of the closest times the world has come to nuclear war. If a US U-2 plane being shot down over Cuba wasn't enough of an escalation, it's what was happening below which could have seen the crisis turn. US destroyers had launched practice depth charges on Soviet submarine B-59 in the hopes of forcing it to the surface. What they didn't know was that the sub was armed with a torpedo, a bomb equivalent to that of Hiroshima. Yet, authorization to fire was needed from 3 senior officers, and Vasily Arkhipov did not consent, meaning that the missile was never launched. Today, we imagine a different outcome. I'm Darryl Morris, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Cuban Missile Crisis and the shots that were never fired from the Soviet sub B-59. Yet, just how perilous was this moment? How close did we actually come to nuclear war? Those are the questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian, Rear Admiral, Dr. Chris Parry, and for the first time on the channel is the historian and distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins Kissinger Center, Sergey Radchenko. Sergey, welcome to you. Chris, welcome. Lovely to have you both. I'm really looking forward to this episode. What a story, what a moment in history, and what potential for a different outcome. We have in front of us here the map of Cuba, as you can see. You've got the tip of Florida down here too, and the blockade that Kennedy arranged, or, Chris, the quarantine, if we're leaning into Kennedy's diplomacy.
Yeah, it's effectively a blockade. It had to be called quarantine at the time because it would have contravened international law at the time. Very clever sort of sidestep of that issue, to tell the truth. But the background to this basically is that until 1959, Cuba had been basically dominated by a regime under a chap called Batista. He'd been in power since 1952. And those of you who've seen the film The Godfather 2 will know how that revolution came about. And the Castro brothers essentially initiated a revolution in Cuba. From 1959 onwards, the CIA and also the American government were complicit very much in trying to destabilize that regime through essentially the threat of invasion, but also basically conducting terrorist and sabotage activities as well. And you had an abortive invasion in a thing called the Bay of Pigs. Everybody's familiar with that. A really poorly planned and poorly executed invasion that didn't spark any sort of uprising. There were various attempts to destabilize the regime after that. There's a thing called Operation Mongoose, a whole series of things where the Army of Northern Virginia, as I call the CIA, was involved. And all in all, the tensions were building. At the same time, there was a significant missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union felt, obviously, that it was in a very poor place strategically. It only had about 20 missiles that could directly hit the United States in terms of intercontinental activity, up against probably 3,200 missiles that the United States had. So a significant missile gap. So That and the fact that at the time President Khrushchev had designs on getting West Berlin into the Soviet orbit added an additional complication and broadening of this. But what really precipitated the crisis was the deployment of Thor nuclear missiles to Italy and the United Kingdom, and also Jupiter missiles, all of which could hit Moscow into Turkey. And so this was sort of coming up. Now, because of all the overflights that were occurring with U-2 spy planes and some other lower level things, the Cuban regime said, look, we really need some protection here. Can we have some anti-aircraft missiles? And at the time, the Soviets had a great missile system called the SA-2 guideline, which as NATO would call it. And initially, Nikita Khrushchev said, no, you're not having them. These are very good missiles. The Cubans then started talking to the Chinese and saying, look, the Soviets are sort of neglecting us a bit. They're faltering in their revolutionary ardor and all this sort of thing. Come and help us. And the Russians felt, we've got to do something. So they started deploying these SA-2 guideline missiles to Cuba. And at the same time, they started thinking about, Cuba's quite close to the United States. What are the prospects of actually putting nuclear missiles in there, not only to threaten mainland United States, because they could already hit Alaska with missiles in Siberia, but they couldn't actually hit continental United States with what they had in any sort of weight. But at the same time, that would deter, they hoped, an invasion of Cuba and keep Castro on side. I think that's probably enough to be going on with.
Yeah, OK, that's fascinating. So we've got this sort of the tensions there between the US and the Soviet Union. Cuba sort of brought into it, Sergey. Kennedy gets the intel that this is being sort of built in Cuba. Take us from there.
Well, Kennedy gets the intel from approximately, obviously, we had the U-2 overflight in October on October 14th. Kennedy gets the information about the placement of intermediate and medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, something the Soviets had repeatedly denied. They said to the Americans that they would not put offensive weapons in Cuba. And so this was a surprise. I guess it was a surprise for Kennedy. It was a miracle that those missiles had not been discovered earlier. The Soviets undertook for the first time a massive operation to put missiles in Cuba, which a lot of them were actually shipped out of Ukraine. They were put on these big ships, taken across the Atlantic Ocean. The operation was called Anadyr, which is the name of a river in the Arctic wilderness of Russia, in order to disguise the whole operation, right? And the captains were not even told where they were going until they were out in the open sea. And then they took those missiles to Cuba, and then challenges began. How do you take missiles on small, Cubas and put them in place? You have to change the roads. You have to build up sites, etc. So it entailed a lot of activity, and actually signals were coming through, including through West German intelligence, that were indicating the Soviets were doing something like bringing missiles into Cuba, but there was no direct confirmation until the U-2 overflight. And so the blessing was, of course, for the Soviets rather, that Cuba was under cloud in the early October. And then finally, Kennedy received this information that they were clear evidence the Soviets had placed those missiles in Cuba, but he didn't know what state of construction those sites were. He didn't know what parts of the missiles had already arrived. And in fact, some warheads were still en route to Cuba at that time, and would continue going there until October 22nd, when Kennedy, of course, made his famous quarantine speech.
OK, let's talk about the missiles themselves and, crucially, their ranges. OK, we have another map of ranges, Chris. This is an extraordinary map that gives us a sense of the scale, doesn't it? What are we looking at here?
So this is what the Americans think is happening. They're getting intelligence, of course, that missiles are being transported. They're getting U-2 overflight information. They're getting satellite information as well. But the weather's not been great. They've also had a surveillance gap. They had a U-2 plane shot down over Sakhalin island in the Far East. A Taiwanese U-2 had been shot down. So they'd actually put a stoppage on U-2 flights right up to the point when they start reflying them again in the middle of October. So people are quite sensitive about the information that they're getting. They're also getting information from the past, from a chap called Oleg Penkovsky. He's a double agent. And he has actually given information about Soviet missile capabilities. And what the Americans think they're looking at in Cuba are three types of nuclear weapon. One is basically a bomber-based bomb, and that's, as you can see, 630 nautical miles. That takes you well up into the United States. There's the SS-4, NATO's designation, which is 1,000 nautical miles, you see, and more importantly, the SS-5 that takes you all the way up into Canada. So if you're in Vancouver and Seattle, you're actually quite safe.
Place to be.
But the interesting thing is, although the Americans think SS-5s have been deployed to Cuba, they haven't actually. Right. But that's the threat they think they're facing.
Right, OK. I mean, significant, Sergey. You can imagine what's going through their mind.
Obviously, this is a real threat to Kennedy, but it's not just to the United States, but also political threat to Kennedy, because remember that Kennedy is facing a midterm election in November 1962. And so he doesn't want to appear like a guy who's been duped by the Soviets, who's allowed the Soviets to build up a missile base right under American nose. So that has serious political implications as well, not just security implications for the United States.
Yeah, okay.
There's another issue as well. He's had a series of foreign policy failures. He's had the Bay of Pigs invasion failure. He's had a real debacle in Laos in Southeast Asia. And of course, the Berlin Wall's just been built and nothing's been done about it. And so that's a series of policy failures. So Kennedy's thinking, look, I've got to look tough here. If I'm not tough, then obviously the midterms and even American prestige is at stake here.
We'll talk more about the B-59 in a minute. But just in terms of the weapon that's on that sub, where does that sort of fit into our understanding? OK,
so in some ways it's slightly detached. Four very modern conventional submarines. We call them Foxtrot class. There's one actually in the Medway at Rochester, sitting there right now. You can actually see it as you cross the bridge. But in 1962, it was actually quite modern. They'd only built them from about 1959 onwards. They got a great range, so they can go pretty much all the way to Cuba on their own from Murmansk in the Northern Fleet. And four of them are dispatched. And the idea is that they're going to be based at Mariel, which is a naval port in Cuba. They're not part of this initially. It's designed to go and actually reinforce the regime, not to provide anything in relation to this crisis. They're armed with 22 torpedoes, one of which is nuclear. Right. And the Americans don't know that. So that's something that only the Soviets knew at the time. And specifically, that torpedo can only be cleared by two officers. In the case of the B-59, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's actually three officers, because you've not just got a political officer and the captain, you've also got the deputy brigade commander, a chap called Archipov, who we'll talk about later. So you've got that additional issue there. But the other three Foxtrot-class submarines have each got a nuclear torpedo as well.
And Sergey, how do what America has, how does that sort of compare? What they've got in terms of weaponry in Turkey, for example?
Look, those are different kinds of missiles. They're land-based missiles. They can strike targets in the Soviet Union. They're called Jupiter missiles. By the way, by 1962, those missiles are basically outdated already, and the Americans are beginning to think about potentially removing them from there. There was a joke about those missiles. Once you launch them, it's not clear which way they would fly. But the Soviets are concerned about them because, look, that means that the reaction time, if you think about the ballistic trajectory, the reaction time for the Soviets is very short with those missiles in Turkey. And actually, to add to what Chris had said, if you think about this from the standpoint of Khrushchev, he's having those missiles right under his belly, basically, very close to the Soviet territory. It's not just a security issue, it's humiliation. How is it that the Americans are able to threaten the Soviet Union in this kind of way, while the Soviet Union is unable to threaten the Americans in this kind in exactly the same kind of way. And so the reason for the deployment of the IRBMs and MRBMs, i.e. the intermediate and medium range ballistic missiles to Cuba, was in part to address this humiliation in addition to security, to the security part of this equation.
Okay. I think it's important that as we talk about this, what the Americans are thinking about. Now, Kennedy's being advised at the moment that he should stand up a very heavy air attack on Cuba, followed by a land invasion. And so the Soviets are having to game what's going to happen here. And Castro at one stage says, look, I really like these missiles launched. He actually says it. And obviously the Soviets say no. It culminates, as we know, on the 27th with a U-2 flight being shot down by an SA-2 guideline, one of these surface-to-air missiles. And that's done on Soviet authority by the commanders themselves. They haven't referred back. So it's quite a tense situation here. That you've got quite a lot of local control of weaponry. That's the first thing. And you've got a situation where nobody quite knows what the bluff and counter-bluff is going on at this stage.
Yeah, OK. That's a... Go on, Sergey.
I was just going to add to this. I mean, this, of course, is the famous or infamous Black Saturday, October 27th, 1962. Tensions are building up. So we have Kennedy's speech, the quarantine speech on October 22nd, which is they monitor it in Moscow and they realize, first of all, they're worried that there's going to be an outright invasion of Cuba. Now, Kennedy, of course, does not go for that, although he considered an outright invasion or an bombardment of Cuba, bombardment and invasion. He doesn't go for this option. He declares the quarantine of Cuba, and Khrushchev gets some breathing space. So for a few days, he kind of tries to figure out. He negotiates with Kennedy. He's kind of playing back and forth. And then you have a series of events on October 27th, the Black Saturday, which Chris has already alluded to. So one of the U-2 planes is shot down over Cuba. Major Rudolph Anderson, his plane is brought down. And then you have another U-2 overflight by accident over Chukotka in the Soviet Arctic, totally by accident, right? And so that also happens on Black Saturday. So any number of events, I mean, things are just going wrong, right, on all fronts. And Khrushchev is extremely, extremely tense at this moment.
Well, I think also Sergey, it's worth mentioning, of course, that, on the 26th, America went to DEFCON 2. So its nuclear forces...
Right.
Its nuclear forces are at high alert. You've got an eighth of Strategic Air Command actually on 15 minutes notice. And you've actually got 23 B-52s, nuclear armed, circling the Soviet Union. So the pressure on Khrushchev is absolutely huge at this point. He started this, but doesn't actually think he's in control of the game anymore. But just think about it. Strategic Air Command is at DEFCON 2, the day before the incident we're going to discuss. And as I said, 23 B-52s in the air, and the rest of them pretty much on 15 minutes alert.
And can I just add one thing, Chris? And this is you already alluded to, that really famous, infamous episode with Fidel Castro basically implying that it was the best thing to do for the Soviet Union to use the missiles against the United States. So it's the use them or lose them mentality. He's basically saying, look, we're going to be invaded and those missiles are going to be taken out. So why don't we just
use them anyway?
And he later denied it. He said, I never said anything like that. But we have documentation reported by the Soviet ambassador in Cuba who basically told Khrushchev, and Khrushchev just went ballistic with that. We have him on record in the days after this statement from Fidel Castro, where he just said, Fidel Castro, how can he think like that? He's totally crazy. How can you be so blinded by revolutionary passions that you would actually desire to begin a nuclear war? So Khrushchev, this is actually one of the reasons why ultimately Khrushchev decides to capitulate in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he thinks things are really just going out, just going off the rails at this point.
Okay, let's hone in then. Let's focus back on Cuba and what's going on in and around the blockade. Okay, let's return to our map of the blockade, quarantine, importantly, of course, in Kennedy's language. Chris, go on. Okay, talk us through where we are now here and where do we go from here? So
the quarantine that's been imposed here has got to be seen in the context of the fact that America is also preparing for nuclear war here. They've already briefed their allies because some of this could come their way in Europe. They've also engaged the Organization of American States because it's in the Western Hemisphere and it affects countries like Venezuela, who contribute 2 frigates, for example, for this. But they put a massive task force down into this area here. It's centred on the aircraft carrier Essex and also an anti-submarine carrier called the Randolph. And they've got a series of task forces that are designed to quarantine, you're absolutely right, in legalese terms, the island of Cuba, to stop any Soviet merchant ships carrying weapons. That's the key point. They can take in oil, they can take in food and all that sort of thing, but they're going to board these vessels, see what they're carrying, and if they've got weapons, they're going to turn them back. And certainly that's what the intention is as we build up towards the 27th. And all round, you've got air and sea patrols, and the Americans put in a massive presence here. There's no question. If you look at the accounts of the 4 submarines that are coming down into this area from Murmansk, they're talking all the time about the fact there's a heavy presence of American aircraft and ships all around them. So we're talking about, 22 destroyers. We're talking about 30 support ships. You're talking about aviation coming from Florida, from Puerto Rico. So this is absolutely saturated with American air and sea patrols. And into this, we have these 4 Foxtrot-class submarines, and they've had a horrible transit on the way down to Murmansk. They were actually told they were deploying into the Atlantic, so they don't have any warm weather provision at all. They're running out of food. They've all got basic skin conditions because there's no fresh water. They've had to stay covert, so under the surface a lot of the time. In order to charge their batteries, they can either come up to the surface or they can use their snorkel mast. And certainly, on the way down, there have been indications, the Americans have detected that there have been these submarines in the North Atlantic, because they've detected these snorkel masts. Now, on the 24th, they issue a notice to mariners, and they say, if you're a submerged submarine and you're anywhere near this quarantine zone, we are going to be dropping practice charges to get you to come to the surface to identify yourself. But best of all, stay away completely. But if you're submerged, we are going to invite you to surface. And the reason we want to do that is to identify you and we will drop these scare charges. And it's very important. All the historiography of the time says they're practice depth charges. They're not. They're 1 pound grenades, basically. I've used them myself during the Cold War to indicate to submarines what we're doing. That's what they are. They go crack. They don't go boom. It's as simple as that. But we've got to remember the conditions for the ship's companies of these submarines are absolutely atrocious. They're living on pretty rancid water. Their food supplies are running out. And as I said, they've all got very bad skin conditions. Hot, especially in the engine rooms. And you get reports of the commanding officers, for example, being very short-tempered, on a very short fuse. As a guy called Andreev says, I really think my CO is cracking up. He says on the way down, actually writes it in a letter on the way down. That's another one of the submarines. And what they do is they get into position. They actually get into position in quadrants around Cuba, one here, one down here, one here, and one here. And one of them is never detected at all. The B4, never detected. It's commanded by a very competent submariner who never gets detected. The other 3 are and are forced to the surface. And one of those eventually is B-59. But there is a drama which takes place, of course, in that submarine.
Indeed. OK. And so, Sergey, what are the Soviets attempting to achieve here?
Well, what they're attempting to achieve is they're trying to, at this point, de-escalate a crisis that is building up around Cuba. We have the declaration of quarantine on October 22nd. The ships that are en route, the surface ships that are en route to Cuba that are carrying, for example, warheads for some of the missiles that are based or being deployed to Cuba, they are ordered to turn around. They never actually go to Cuba. I mean, Khrushchev understands what Chris was just referring to. In fact, it's really interesting because, before the whole crisis, while they were discussing deployment of missiles to Cuba, Che Guevara and Raul Castro turned up in Moscow to negotiate how all of this would work out. And Che Guevara which obviously is Fidel Castro's revolutionary comrade, raised this question. He said, well, what happens if the Americans do something about those missiles? And Khrushchev said, we will send the Baltic Fleet, right? We would send the Baltic Fleet. But he couldn't, and this was seen as anecdotal evidence for many years until recently I actually found confirmation this is exactly what Khrushchev promised, because Che Guevara remembered that and later complained to the Chinese. He said, the Chinese asked him, what were the Soviets thinking? And Che Guevara said, well, they said that they would send the Baltic Fleet. And of course, the Soviets could never possibly send the Baltic Fleet there and engage with the Americans in their backyard with the massive, overwhelming force that was there. So what they're trying to do at this point, I think Khrushchev is trying to do, he's bluffing at one level. He's saying, look, the American actions, quarantine is illegal. You're not allowed to do that, et cetera, et cetera. We're fully within our rights to place whatever we want. At the same time, it's clear that he's scared. And from October 22nd until October 25th, there are all these debates in the Politburo and the Presidium, it was called Presidium at that time, about what to do. By October 25th, he actually cracks. He's starting to, he's looking for a way to back out of Cuba. And then, of course, it takes a couple of more days before this materializes into an actual decision. But we know that Khrushchev is not willing to risk a nuclear confrontation, or he's risking it already, but he's not willing to go to nuclear war with the United States over Cuba.
Yeah, not keen on it at all, which is really important for us to consider. Okay, on board the B-59, Chris, crucially, is a man called Vasily Arkhipov.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know him as being, and we'll sort of flesh out his role in a moment, but I think it's really worth us understanding him as a character and his temperament and his life and sort of career up to getting on B-59.
Yeah, so Archipov is the Deputy Brigade Commander. It's quite interesting. Before these submarines depart, a large number of senior Soviet submarine admirals and commodores decide they're ill. It's quite extraordinary if you look at the records. And he's actually in a place where he wasn't expecting to be. But he's there, Archipov. He's actually a career submariner. He's actually been in a nuclear incident where a reactor has started to go wrong in a previous submarine, K-19. So he's been affected by that. He understands radiation and things like that. In the submarine itself, you have the captain, who's called Savitsky. And you also have a signals intelligence officer called Vadim Orlov, who is the only person that really gives evidence about what happened in the submarine. Now, there are so many discrepancies in the story about how this happens. I think we need to go through it. So Savitsky is known to be on a very short fuse. He's under a lot of pressure. And we've got to bear in mind that all four of these submarines have been told not to be detected. So they're staying down as long as they can. So unless they come up and use their snorkel or indeed surface, they can't recharge their batteries. So conditions are really bad down below. You've got people fainting. You've got people in the engine rooms passing out. You've got nausea. You've got all sorts of problems in these submarines. And every submarine reports that. It's not just the B-59. And they're under real pressure to come up. And every one of them, except for B-4, which isn't detected, is getting these scare charges thrown down on them. And in the notice to mariners on the 24th of October, the Americans say quite clearly, if you hear these scare charges, come up, because we're just going to keep hunting you down. And in the end, at 2 o'clock, and this is quite critical, 2 o'clock in the morning, B-59 comes to the surface in response to this. Now, it's overflown by a tracker aircraft, an S-2, which is normally a carrier-based surveillance aircraft. If you listen to Orlov says, I wasn't actually on the fin of the submarine, but there were shots fired alongside the submarine. Now, there's two problems with this. One is the S-2 doesn't have guns. That's the first thing. It's a surveillance aircraft. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, so how are you going to see this? And by the way, you weren't on the fin, were you? Now, if you look at the various sort of accounts, the conventional account says Savitsky came to the top of the fin, or he didn't. He may have been in the ops room. He was under pressure. And because of what was going on, overflights by the aircraft, destroyers closing in, obviously with searchlights and everything, he then says, look, I'm going to blast them all. It doesn't matter if we die. We're going to blast them all. Prepare the nuclear number one torpedo, which is the nuclear torpedo. Now, so many things wrong with this, because then apparently Archipov says, well, you need my permission to arm and fire it. You also need the political officer's permission. The political officer apparently said, yeah, I'm okay with this. Now, what's interesting, in another submarine, one of these submarines, one of the captains was getting so fed up with the political officer that he said, okay, load the thing, okay? And the political officer promptly, when he saw it loaded and prepared, fainted. Now, whether that was down to the air supply or the shock, that was the case. But that was performative. So the captain of the submarine, B-59, goes through this very sort of, I think, hysterical response to being obviously coming to the surface. And we need to be very clear what the rules of engagement for using the nuclear torpedo were at this time. And these are very, very clear. Okay, it means if you are submerged and you have a hull penetration, you can fire your nuclear torpedo. If you come to the surface and you are engaged, you can use it, and you can do it by permission of your commander-in-chief back in Murmansk. Now, they're out of contact, so that's not the case. Savitsky doesn't know what's going on. All he knows is he's cornered by the Americans. We get this hysterical reaction. Critically, Archipov in 1997 at the Kirov Academy never mentions it. He never mentions this issue over the torpedo at all. So I don't know what Sergey thinks, but I think this is just a totally spurious reaction.
Right.
And he said it, you know, he's lost his cool. Nothing ever happens. We were never close to nuclear war at any stage. I'm sorry to debunk that myth. What do you think, Sergey?
Go on, Sergey.
So, Chris, I agree. There are lots of uncertainties here, right? We rely on this oral history that is contradictory. We don't have any evidence to back any of those claims in terms of documentary evidence. By the way, in 2022, the Russian Ministry of Defense declassified a lot of documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I and Vlad Zubok were able to take a look at. Vlad Zubok is a fellow historian. We were able to look at a Soviet post-mortem written by one of the Soviet commanding officers in Cuba about everything that, you know, how the Soviets handled the Cuban Missile Crisis from the military standpoint. You know what's missing from that? Any account of the submarine of this particular issue. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. You know, maybe it's somewhere there in the archives. But the fact that we have a whole post-mortem that covers everything, deployment to Cuba, en route, you know, how things were played out, et cetera, and none of that actually mentioned this particular incident. I think, to me, that is an interesting piece of evidence. Now, here's another thing that we need to keep in mind. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what the Soviet officers could and could not do at this point. The Soviets didn't really have procedures worked out properly. In fact, this question came up not in relation to submarines, but in relation to the nuclear weapons on Cuba, because there were two types of effective nuclear weapons. There were strategic nuclear weapons, there were tactical nuclear weapons that were being deployed as a part of this Cuban operation. And so from the start, the Soviet Presidium, the leadership, issued directions to the Soviet commanding officer in Cuba, Isapliev, that he could not use the strategic missiles in Cuba without permission from Moscow. But there was great uncertainty about tactical nuclear weapons. Could he have used them if, for example, communication with Moscow broke down? On October 22nd, when Khrushchev heard about quarantine declaration by Kennedy, an instruction was sent to Cuba saying no use of any nuclear weapons whatsoever. You know, no tactical nuclear weapons, no strategic nuclear weapons. I don't know. I have not seen any evidence whether any of that was passed down to the captains of nuclear submarines. I don't know, Chris, what you have seen.
Would they were out of communication?
Well, I think when they left, I've seen a document, Sergey, which says the three criteria that I mentioned. You know, if you get a hull penetration when you're submerged, then you can fire the nuclear weapon. If you are attacked when you're on the surface, then you can do it, and obviously on command. I think the ones you're thinking about, Sergey, are the short-range nuclear weapons that are out to about 40 kilometers. They're the ones that were designed to hit ships, weren't they?
Well, where I'm talking about the
island,
the so-called on the island, you have the FRKs, the what do you call that? I don't know what the English translation of them. Those are the short-term missiles. You also have the Luna rockets. etc. So those are considered tactical, or were considered tactical nuclear weapons. The Americans did not even know that they existed in Cuba, that they were actually in Cuba. And the interesting thing is, on October 22nd, when Khrushchev realized that things were going haywire, there was an instruction cabled to the Soviet commander in Cuba saying, do not use any of that without explicit authorization. So a mystery for me, if an instruction is issued to Isapliev, the Soviet commander in Cuba, would not the same instruction also be issued to submarine commanders, that they're not to use tactical nuclear weapons without authorization, additional authorization from Moscow? I don't know.
Well, as I said, those are the three criteria. I mean, the key thing for me, though, Sergey, is Archipov, when he's challenged in the Kirov Academy in '97, says quite specifically, this story simply is to denigrate the senior political and military command. He actually denies it utterly.
Would he not sort of be compelled to do that, though, to sort of protect them?
No. But in '97, basically the Soviet Union was opening up. That would be a good news story for the Soviet Union. You want to tell the world that you saved it. It was a good.
It's embarrassing
for him personally, right? I mean, this is the man who, quote unquote, saved the world. He should have said, yeah, of course, I made the decision that, this was not a good idea, et cetera, et cetera. It would be great for him. But no, he does not mention that. And this in itself is kind of revealing. I mean, this is interesting. And I just wanted to offer some reflections as a historian. Sometimes when writing history, we don't really have enough evidence to make a claim, but we have bits and pieces of contradictory evidence. And I think sometimes we are tempted to increase the value of that evidence for the general public, because the general public loves this kind of stories. We love people who saved the world, right? We love Ivan Archipov because he's the guy who saved the world. Whether or not he saved the world, whether he himself thought so, is irrelevant. We want to project that to the broader public, sometimes on pretty thin evidence.
So, okay then, Sergey, how close do you actually think we came then to this going hot?
I don't know. We don't have, like I said, if we come up with evidence later, documentary evidence, like a post-mortem report on what B-59 was actually doing, that was signed by Archipov, something like this, you would expect there has to be a report about, some kind of a conflict on board a submarine where the captain wants to use a nuclear torpedo, but another officer disagrees. You would expect that to be reflected. There has to be documentary trace. Now, I want to be clear. Some things have not been declassified. We still don't know all about what happened on the Soviet side during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We may never know, but on this particular issue, I think if something actually happened, there has to be more than oral history, contradictory oral history about it. Yeah, I think the best we can say about this is there may have been something, but it's not clear what exactly happened, and it is not clear that we can definitely say on the basis of the existing evidence that the world nearly came to a nuclear Armageddon from that particular episode. But this is not to downplay the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were many other episodes that were just as scary, actually.
Just quickly, how did the story actually emerge then? It was in the early 2000s, right?
Essentially, a journalist came up with this story that this had happened. It relies totally on the testimony of a chap called Vadim Orlov, who I said was a junior officer in a submarine B-59. It was picked on by a journalist who then publicised it. And I'm afraid a conference in 2002 made a really big deal of it based on no evidence whatsoever.
Right.
And it ballooned from there. And, as Sergey says, this is Hollywood stuff. You could actually make a film out of this if you actually rationalise it. But the evidence isn't there. And a lot of it is just so contradictory. And the fact that the main player himself doesn't talk about it is absolutely decisive in saying, well, hang on, this can't have happened. Because this is a good story, if it's true. I mean, I think Sergey's right. I mean, the real problem here that I have with the Cuban Missile Crisis is the obscure way in which some of the permissions on the Soviet side were given. So we've already had, a Soviet commander shooting down a U-2 without permission. So they did that on their own initiative. You've got these short-range missiles, which basically are anti-shipping in Cuba. And I think the biggest chance of a crisis here was probably an accident. And if you translate that into the submarine scenario, it's probably loading the wrong torpedo into the tube. But it takes about 45 minutes to an hour hour to prepare a nuclear torpedo. So you can't exactly just say fire one and then off it goes. It doesn't happen like that.
Can I just be clear on something? Are you saying that the torpedo was loaded, but using the example of another sub, perhaps in a performative way, or not loaded at all? You don't believe any of that?
So we know that in one of the submarines, the nuclear weapon was loaded to actually demonstrate to the political...
But you don't think it was on the B-59?
Definitely not on the B-59, because even if we take the evidence as it stands, they said prepare the torpedo. Now, you would not have a nuclear torpedo in the tubes. It's far too vulnerable there. The other problem, I have to say, with Soviet nuclear weapons at the time, they were notoriously unreliable. Right. So even if the thing had been fired, it may have been a dud, because about 2 out of 5, both missiles and torpedoes, were duds in those days. I have to say, on the American side, they obviously has reliability problems as well, but not quite so bad. So it would have been quite ironic if they had actually loaded it and launched it and the thing hadn't actually exploded.
OK.
I mean, that's a different story.
Yeah, I was going to say, that is a different story. OK, interesting. So, obviously, no torpedo is fired. The subsurfaces, the rest is history. This is normally the bit where we undo that and consider what might have happened. We've sort of already done that a little bit, haven't we, here, which is fascinating. But let's suspend our disbelief and consider a different version of events and how different history could have been because of it. This is History Undone. OK, now let's get into doing what we love to do here on History Undone. Ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions. Had the crisis gone hot? And we've sort of undone the real version of events already. Let's suspend our disbelief on that for a moment, Chris, and explain to me how it could have. How could this have gone wrong? How could a torpedo have been fired?
Well, I don't think a torpedo would have been fired given the circumstances. You've got 3 out of 4 of the submarines under pressure. I think if the Americans had sunk one of the submarines, I think there would probably been an escalation with regard to the other 3. Right. And you might have actually had a torpedo fired at one of the carrier groups, something like that. That might have been a way of escalating it. The Americans are very careful not to sink these submarines. I mean, Kennedy actually has a moment, it's on tape, and Robert Kennedy reported that when he was told they were dropping depth charges, which is wrong. They were scare charges. As I said, only £1 charge. Kennedy actually put his hand to his face and said, "Oh, we can't possibly sink one of these submarines." So that was probably an escalatory move if one of them had been sunk, because the other 3 would be going, "Well, that's us next." Interestingly enough, when they got back to the Northern Fleet, the fleet commander said, "We weren't expecting you to come back. We thought you'd get sunk." He actually said that. So that's not great for morale. Yeah. But I think the only way in which this goes hot is if there's an accident and somebody is either trigger happy or misinterprets something from the other side. We know that Khrushchev is trying to de-escalate at this stage, but we've got to consider the Americans are at DEFCON 2. We've mentioned before what that means. They are at a very high state of alert, not just for defence, but also attack as well. And these 23 B-52s circling the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union know they're there. It's as simple as that. The other thing is the American counter-missile defences are very much alerted. You've got over 500 fighter aircraft deployed down here. You've got surface-to-air missiles. The pictures of them with Americans driving along beaches here in Florida with a missile system alongside, waiting for these to come in. And you've also got, on alert and airborne, over 30 fighter aircraft with nuclear-armed air-to-air missiles. Nuclear-armed. In this day and age, we never think about that. But these are designed, essentially, to put nuclear weapons into the air to intercept some of these ballistic missiles. So you've got a very tense situation towards the 26th, 27th, where the Americans are very, very much with their fingers on the trigger, and you've got the poor old Soviets desperately trying to de-escalate this situation. But they've got options.
Yeah. OK, Sergey.
Well, options, of course, were available, but also let's talk about the possibilities for escalation. So we could have, let's say, we had an accidental use of a torpedo. I don't know. Chris already said that it's pretty much unthinkable. But suppose we had a launch of one of those nuclear torpedoes by one of the submarines. The Americans would then have to take the next step, right? So they would presumably use nuclear weapons. Against who exactly would they use nuclear weapons? Against the Soviet Union, but President Kennedy would have to consider the consequences. And he did not know what assets the Soviets had on Cuba. I mean, he had an idea. He did not know the state of their readiness. So he, for example, if he's thinking, okay, the Soviets had launched, had begun a local nuclear war, we're going to retaliate. We'll go a step higher, will attack, for example, the Soviet Union. What will the Soviets do, and what kind of possibilities do they have to attack us from Cuba, for example? Now, let me briefly talk about what's happening in Cuba at this moment. So the Soviets have been, since October 22nd, they were kind of slow in moving those missiles, positioning them into places. Some of the warheads, as I mentioned, for SS-5s never arrived. They're sent back to the Soviet Union. And so what the Soviets then have is a situation where they have some missiles, but they have to be like parts and bits and pieces from SS-5s have to be cannibalized for SS-4s, in order to make things work. They also have protocols, and this is something we are only finding out today. They have protocols about how to store those missiles. And what do you know? The missiles were stored separately from warheads. Warheads were stored in a bunker. Missiles were stored somewhere else at the sites. And also missiles had to be fueled because they had liquid fuel, so they had to be fueled up, and that took a lot of time. And so the interesting thing is the bunker with nuclear warheads is located sometimes actually quite far away from the sites where actual missiles are deployed. So if an order came from Moscow to actually fire those missiles, it would take at least 24 hours for them to prepare for the launch. So in the end, it seems that the Soviet options were actually not that great. They were quite limited in Cuba, certainly. It doesn't mean that Kennedy was not right in taking a very careful path, in treating a very careful path, and not going overboard with escalation. I mean, of course, originally some of the ideas that were peddled to Kennedy was to basically invade Cuba right away and try to take out those sites. He went against that, and he went with the quarantine option instead, because he did not know. There was no certainty, right? And the lack of certainty was a form of deterrence. So the Soviets perhaps did not have the kind of capabilities that Kennedy thought they had.
I think it's quite interesting because thinking of it from a military point of view, what I think would have happened here is the Americans would have said, look, is this a containable crisis here with this nuclear weapon? What I am convinced the Americans would have done is they would have devastated Cuba immediately. Curtis LeMay, who was the head of Strategic Air Command, always wanted to attack Cuba, right up until the time it was actually settled with Khrushchev. LeMay was saying, we've got to flatten Cuba. We've got to go for it now. And 20 years later, he was still saying, we should have gone for it. We should have gone for it at the time.
And Chris, based on what we know, I mean, this was the dilemma for Kennedy, right? Because he asked, can you guarantee, 100% guarantee that if you attack those sites that you'll take them out? And the answer is, well, Mr. President, we cannot guarantee with 100% certainty. And so Kennedy could not take that decision because if even one missile remained, were it to be launched against the United States, we're potentially talking about millions of deaths, right? He did not want to go down in history as that president. But if you kind of imagine a situation where after, let's say, the Soviet nuclear attack with one of the torpedoes, the Americans strike Cuba, and then try to wipe out those sites in Cuba, it seems that the possibility is quite high that the Soviets would not have been able to retaliate with missiles in Cuba, I think.
And the other thing I think we've got to remember here is the SS-4 can only go halfway across America, whereas the American arsenal can destroy the Soviet Union completely. You could absolutely destroy the land area of the Soviet Union with what the Americans have here. Remember, they've got 23,000 nuclear warheads compared to 3,600 Soviet ones. Remember, only 20 are deployable from the mainland United States. So if he devastates Cuba, and as Sergey says, maybe takes out everything as well, you can contain the crisis in the Caribbean. You've got a lot of fallout, mind you, at this stage, going into the Atlantic mostly. But you might consider, and there's a general called Brudenell at the time says, at the time, the Soviet strategic forces froze in place. At the time when we were at DEFCON 1, ready to strike them, they froze. And partly that would have been de-escalatory to say to the Americans, look, we're not interested in playing this game. But also, the Russians just weren't ready for it. And he says at the end of his memoir, we were never further away during the Cold War from nuclear war than we were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it was so asymmetric that the Russians weren't in a position to provide a devastating strike back again.
Right.
But can I just add one thing, Chris? I mean, I guess the fact that these two sides did not really know everything 100% about the other side, I think that added this element of fear, right? And that forced each side to be more cautious than they otherwise would have been, and it made the world safer as a result.
That's right.
If the Americans Americans knew the reality of the Soviet deployment and just how weak the Soviets were at this point, maybe they would have acted more rationally, creating more opportunities for some inadvertent escalation. So in the end, we do say that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous point during the Cold War, and that the two leaders realized how dangerous it was and backed off. If we say today, well, actually, perhaps it wasn't as dangerous, that's also true. But I think it also downplays a little bit the possibility inherent in any kind of confrontation of things just going wrong. And what happened on October 27th with all of those things going wrong simultaneously, with things being shot down, potential crisis on one of the submarines, etc. It's a pointer to how wars can just happen by accident.
Yeah.
And inadvertent escalation was the biggest danger, right? It was not like Khrushchev and Kennedy wanted to start a nuclear war. They didn't.
Yeah, well, quite the opposite. Yeah, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because you sort of look at this story and you think the potential for accident and the sort of the kind of events of Black Saturday, plus the sort of gaps in each other's knowledge about what may come next, motivations, etc. You think of all of those things as being, particularly the sort of gaps in knowledge at the top, as being the reason why somebody may get a bit trigger happy and push the button. But actually the opposite, really.
Yeah,
right?
I think Sergey's absolutely right. It's what you don't know about your opposite number
that keeps you safe.
And his intentions, which makes you cautious.
Yeah.
That's entirely the point. I mean, the Americans never knew that these 4 submarines had a nuclear torpedo in, for example. So that was never part of their calculations.
Is there not a version of events, though, where a torpedo is fired and that is such a sudden, shocking, that would be an absolutely audacious move, so far as Kennedy is concerned, sat in the White House, from the Soviets, the most significant attack on America since Pearl Harbor. Dear God, push the button.
Well, no, the first thing you're going to ask in 1962 is, how's this happened? You won't know it's a torpedo. You might think it's a ballistic missile. Right. You've got to calibrate it initially before you have a response. As I said, my sense, I think, as I said, with the way the force ratios were, the immediate response would have been to devastate Cuba and say to Khrushchev, stay out of this. Say very quickly to the Soviets, we don't want this to be an intercontinental battle. You can't win it anyway. Yeah. We'll contain this. We're going to devastate Cuba. Stay out of it.
And so when we're not looking, the sort of conventional wisdom is that happens, this moment of history, the doors slide in a different way, and the Cold War goes hot. But actually, no.
Yeah, both those sides will want to de-escalate. You don't want to lose your homeland in any case here. Yeah. So you want to contain the crisis, as I said, and then say, let's think about this again. Yeah. I think what the issue is, Sergey, how does this affect nuclear theology going forward, for example? Because you've had the second use since the Second World War of nuclear weapons. Does it lead to... in fact, it does lead to a test ban treaty, of course, a year later. So people are going, yeah, we get it, OK? It also leads to a hotline, so we can talk directly to each other now instead of trying to sort of go backwards and forwards. And we've got to remember, there's a lot of back-channel chat going on here. Robert Kennedy talking to Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. There's this offer of Jupiter missiles being sacrificed, which never becomes public. That is a secret protocol between Kennedy and Khrushchev to actually get rid of the Jupiter missiles, which, as Sergey says, are obsolete. And the problem with that is Khrushchev is seen to have suffered a defeat by his colleagues. And 2 years later, he's out of power because they've lost prestige, they've lost face, they've had to withdraw all their missiles by November of that year. And on the American side, the really interesting thing is they actually say this is an example of where we have to show that our force is credible.
Yeah.
And it leads directly to their involvement in Vietnam.
So I agree with what Chris has just said. Khrushchev was terrified of nuclear weapons in a sense, but he also was willing to play them. He used them for political leverage. He learned that they could be beneficial to advance Soviet interests, beginning actually from the Suez Crisis of 1956, to threaten people with nuclear weapons. Well, if you don't do what we want you to do, we will rain nuclear destruction on you, etc. And that policy led him into the Berlin crisis, 1961, and ultimately, of course, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he was so scared of the latter situation, especially, as I mentioned, right, or we've discussed here, that interaction with Castro when Castro said, look, let's just use nuclear weapons and start a nuclear war. Now, Khrushchev did not want to see that happen. And so Chris is absolutely right to point out that one of the consequences of this crisis was that Khrushchev decided to engage the United States more honestly in an arms control dialogue, from which we have the partial nuclear test ban treaty that is then signed in August of 1963, a major breakthrough on the arms control front. Who benefited from? Khrushchev insisted that he won in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think he knew that he lost. I think his colleagues also realized that he lost. Now, what Chris mentioned, there were, of course, deals that were made. So Kennedy promised that the United States would never invade Cuba again. This was a public promise, public pledge, which Khrushchev insisted on. And then there was the secret agreement that the United States would withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey. And you know what? If Khrushchev actually insisted on a public agreement, we now have evidence to suggest that the American Kennedy would probably have gone with a public agreement to withdraw American missiles from Turkey, which would have been kind of humiliating for the United States, actually, to retreat under pressure. But Khrushchev was more scared. Khrushchev sort of blinked first as the lore goes, although I think both sides were blinked in the end. So by 1964, Khrushchev is thrown out of power by his colleagues, who actually mentioned this issue of the Cuban Missile Crisis as a misadventure Khrushchev got them into, and they used that as one of the arguments against Khrushchev when he was being removed.
Right. Okay. So there's quite a lot of sort of de-escalation going on, even in our version of events, Chris. Where does it sort of bring us today? How does the rest of the 20th century look?
Well, I think it continues very much as we thought. If it stabilises after even a short nuclear exchange, for example, you still get proxy wars between a Soviet Union, which is ideologically opposed to obviously what we called the West at the time. I think what you do end up with is real pressure. Two things can happen. Either other countries will say we need nuclear weapons. And indeed, one of the things we haven't mentioned, of course, are the British and French nuclear programs that are going on at this stage. And other countries, like China, would say straight away, we need them. And in fact, they did say that. China immediately realises it has to accelerate its program. And of course, it starves a lot of its people at the time to get the resources in order to be able to get nuclear weapons. So I think you'd see other countries gaining nuclear weapons. So Israel, of course, South Africa maybe at this stage. I think you'd see a proliferation of these things. What's quite interesting, of course, is we've got a whole spectrum of nuclear weapons in 1962 that we don't have today. So on the Western side at the moment, the idea of using air-to-air nuclear weapons, quite extraordinary. But what we are seeing nowadays is a build-up of that same spectrum again, because the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles is no longer sufficient when you have countries like Russia saying, look, in any conventional crisis, and I think China subscribes to this as well, we're going to escalate to de-escalate by using tactical nuclear weapons. So some of the debate that we see around what happens in 1962 is happening again now, because we have a much more fractious world today. We have personalities in some ways that are similar to the ones that we had in the 1960s. And so the whole nuclear debate now is being refreshed, and at what stage you engage with nuclear weapons with conventional ones. So that, again, I think the debates that we had in 1962, and I was alive in 1962, I was actually sitting in a classroom in Portsmouth when all this was going on, are going to happen again now, because we're back into that sort of world. And I think, Sergey, would you agree with that?
Yes, Chris, absolutely. But I just wanted to add the two differences between 1962 and where we are now. We started our discussion with you mentioning that the Soviet nuclear arsenal was very unreliable in 1962. Their intercontinental ballistic missiles were not, very, very few, very unreliable. What we see today is we have a Russian nuclear arsenal that is unquestionably much more reliable.
Yes, indeed.
Right. So if we were in a nuclear confrontation today, whether it involves Russia, the United States, or China, or any other number of nuclear powers, then the slide towards Armageddon, I think, would be more assured, because it was much more difficult to actually do anything like take out missiles. Like, for example, the Americans had that option in Cuba in 1962. They don't really have this option now. They cannot actually do that because of the much better technology that the Russians have now. The more exact missiles, the MIRV, the multiple independent targeted reentry vehicle missiles that are much more difficult to shoot down. So this makes, I think, the present moment both more dangerous and more stable in a sense, because both sides, I guess, deterrence works much better now, because we know that we would just kill each other if we did something like this. It would be so much more clear that we would be in this situation. Another thing, however, that is very different between 1962 and today is that today we have much better channels of communication. Yep. Both within nuclear forces of each side. So certainly on the Russian side, we're not in a messy situation where in 1962, where it was not clear which commander had which authorization or whether they free delegated authority, etc. We still are confused about 1962. There is no confusion now. We know that for a nuclear weapon to be launched, it would, for example, for Russian nuclear weapon to be launched, it would require Putin's authorization for this to happen, right? We could not be sure in 1962. And in addition, another communication component today is that the two sides are connected in real time. So we saw that play out, in fact, in the fall of 2022, during the so-called nuclear crisis in Ukraine, where there was a possibility in September, October 2022. There was the nuclear crisis over Ukraine, where there was a possibility that the Russians might actually consider some tactical nuclear weapons. The Americans got immediately in touch, right? There was a phone call from Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, to his Russian counterpart saying, what the hell are you doing? And that is something that we did not have. And Chris mentioned that there was a direct hotline installed between Washington and Moscow as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yes, we have learned things, and the world is both more lethal today and also in important ways more stable.
That's interesting.
There is one issue, I think, Sergey, and I agree utterly with what you're saying with both those things, is that we do have an issue with tactical nuclear weapons at the moment. These are scalable nuclear weapons that low yield, they're called, and they are entering the battlefield as battle-fighting weapons at the moment, not deterrent weapons. Now, the assumption in the past is that if you use and as in 2022, as Sergey says, if you use a tactical nuclear weapon, you don't know what the response will be. It can either be another tactical nuclear weapon, or it could be an intercontinental ballistic missile. And the debate is happening now about nuclear theology, about what the place of these tactical nuclear weapons is. And I'm afraid to say quite a lot of countries think it's a big bang that does a lot of destruction for you, perhaps over a kilometre grid square. And the fact that this is entering the language, if you like, of warfare as being simply another war-fighting weapon rather than being a deterrence weapon is actually adding a bit of danger to the current debate, to tell you the truth. And the first manifestation of that, as Sergey said, was in October 2022. Yeah. But that debate still has to happen.
And we're talking here about sort of technological change, aren't we? And we're talking about, this is a technological revolution that we are living through on an extraordinary scale at the moment. This is a version of history full of kind of accidents and coincidences and misunderstandings. And it is human decision-making and human logic and human restraint always that kind of brings us back from the brink.
And what you're implying here, Darryl, is what happens when you add artificial intelligence to this.
If a machine is making the decision, this ends differently, doesn't it?
And if you remember your Dr. Strangelove film, that's exactly the issue. That's what the Soviets actually threaten in the film. They say, we've got a proto-AI system that will react automatically whatever happens. So, that is the ghost that is coming down the track at us at the moment.
OK. Extraordinary. Fascinating. Blimey. Wow. I mean, I knew that this was going to be a hugely consequential episode, that we were going to, change history in quite a significant way. But actually, we've undone a lot of this moment of history, haven't we? A huge amount. I'm afraid that's what we've got time for on this episode of History Undone. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Professor Sergey Radchenko for joining us. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe on our channel on YouTube. You can also listen to this as a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for History Undone in your preferred podcast app. Until next time, bye-bye.